Welcome back to Alpha DevCon. In this session, we have Nikos Kazantzis, our solutions engineer, who will be talking to us about APIs and using them with the list control and with the UX. Nikos has prepared a video, and that video runs 1 hour exactly, so I'm not going to waste any time talking anymore. We're just going to start it right up. In the meantime, if you have questions, you can ask those questions either on Slack or in the GoToWebinar control panel. So let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Today's session is about using standard UX controls such as lists and view boxes to access remote APIs and to use those APIs as data sources. And ideally, we would like to be able to use our list and view boxes in the same way that we would use them against SQL data. So to be able to view, filter, add, update, and delete. So the complete Crud cycle that we're able to do with SQL to also be achieved with remote API data. Now, one of the benefits that someone encounters almost immediately when using Alpha Anywhere is obviously the capability to very easily connect to SQL database, SQL data sources, and have that data available to use in our applications. And while there's no single 100% agreed standard in SQL technologies, there are enough similarities for this to be somewhat similar between the different technologies. That is not the case with REST APIs. Essentially, each REST API is a specific implementation. The underlying architecture and style, REST itself, might be standardized, but the implementation of it and the syntax and the format is not. So, that is part of the difficulty in working with REST APIs, which would make it require a little bit more effort in Alpha Anywhere than it would to work with SQL data sources, where having something like portable SQL means we don't even need to care about what the database technology is behind the scenes. But also against REST APIs, we do have multiple options and capabilities when it comes to accessing that data in lists and view boxes in a UX, and we're going to be exploring those today. So the first obvious question is, how do we access the remote API, REST API? And that answer comes always from the provider of the API and their documentation. And the two standard methods, the two most common ones that we find, is that we either have a URL to point to that API, or we have an example of some kind of curl command that we need to use. So here's some typical examples. So this is a fake API provider backend, which we also reference many times in our alpha documentation, just as a sample to point to. And as you can see, the resources that are accessible from this backend, like posts and photos and users, are just a URL. If I open up this link and I get the data that's coming back, this is no more than just a URL pointing to the data and returning that data. That URL, in this case, is plain. It's just a URL with a path. But sometimes there are page variables also attached to it. For example, if we need to point to something more specific, like here. So that's one example. But then in some other cases, we may get something like this. So the API provider tells us to use a curl command, a specific curl command, to access one of the endpoints of the API. So those two major options are what we encounter when we're working with remote REST APIs. And when we're working with URLs, which is the most common option, the curl command obviously still points to a URL, but it's not accessible directly. There are other parameters that are passed in, sometimes not directly possible via just a browser, address URL. So the two next steps we need to examine are what needs to be done with that data, and whether we need to authenticate against that endpoint before being able to connect to it. And when we're talking about actions that can be done against the data, we're talking about the standard options that we also have at our disposal with SQL data, which are view the data, filter, sort, and do CRUD, insert, update, delete, against that remote data. So to view data, again, we're talking about view boxes and lists, are our two main data-driven controls in AUX. So when we have a remote endpoint and we have a view box to view that data, then we have options of doing a server-side call or client-side call to that endpoint. And to do a server-side call is very simple. We just have a URL field in the viewbox properties when we choose a REST API data source. So that is a very quick way to do that. When we do a client-side call, then there is a JavaScript function to enable that. So that is also very simple to set up. If we're talking about a list, then again, there are server-side and client-side call options. If we're talking about a server-side call, then we need to define a custom data source, i.e. an xbasic function. And that xbasic function is what will perform the request out to the endpoint and bring the data back. There's also the option of the client-side call. In that case, we can configure a JSON data source and just enter the URL directly in the data source tab of the list. When working with xbasic, there are some things to consider, some basic functions that are needed to be able to work with. So when we're working with xbasic, if we have a very simple case where we're not passing in any headers, we're just doing very simple REST verbs, then we have HTTP GET, HTTP POST, HTTP PUT, all those individual functions. But if we do need to be more flexible, then we need to use HTTP fetch because that allows us to pass in custom headers as well. If we're working with curl, and we'll see more details later on, there's an xbasic curl genie to help us work with that. And once we retrieve JSON data, one of the complexities of working with remote API endpoints is that not only does the syntax and the format change, but sometimes also the data coming back is in a different state and cannot be used directly. We need to navigate through the data structure to pick up what we need. And the three most common xbasic functions that we need to work with are JSON parse. So if we have a text string that turns into a JSON object, essentially a dot variable in xbasic. JSON generate does the opposite. So it takes a JSON object, or a dot variable, and turns it into a text string. And JSON extract is when we get a complete package from a remote endpoint. Sometimes the item that we're looking for is a few layers deep. And the way that we get to that, instead of working with the whole object, is we can use the JSON extract to just get to the level that we need and bring that back. We'll see examples of all of these later on. So this is what allows now to, in the end, all of these processes result in a JSON string being available to the list or the viewbox client side. And once that is done, then that is an equivalent state to what the list or viewbox got back when we were doing a SQL query. And that's what the alpha server was sending back to the viewbox and list. Behind the scenes, it was doing that automatically. Here, in some cases, that also happens automatically. In some other cases, we need to process what we're getting from the REST API endpoint and send the final required string back to the client. Now, if we want to filter the data that's coming back and not just get all of it, and we want to filter it based on possibly other fields that we might have in our UX, then if we're using a viewbox, then again, we have options of doing it server-side or doing it client-side. If we're doing it server-side, it's important to consider if the API that we're talking with supports things like page variable filters. And we did see an example of this here, for example, where we saw, for example, there is a page variable which says get all the comments, but with a filter of post ID equals 1. So essentially bring 1 back. Or there's a user filter that says get me only the posts from user with ID number 1. So if the API supports those page variables, then we have options in the ViewBox server-side builder to enter those and build the actual complete URL, including those page variables. If not, if the remote API does not support page variables, then we have the option in the ViewBox to do post-processing using XBasic. Remember, we're in a server-side call, so we have XBasic at our disposal, so we can pass the data that's being retrieved to an XBasic function, and the XBasic function can filter through that. Some tips to work with here. If we apply a page variable filter, in this case, it is always applied. So that is a limitation there, that you cannot get complete unfiltered data in this specific path. When we're working with XBasic, there are a number of search functions that we need to consider. Again, if we are filtering, that means we're searching. We're doing a comparison and say, is the data matching some condition that we set? And the way that we do the search is important. If you remember, when we're doing SQL, a normal list in ViewBox SQL filtering, we have an option in our search items to say, are we doing a contains, a like, a starts with, or an exact match, and so on. So the equivalents in XBasic are things like the dollar or the dollar syntax, contains or contains I, to do string search or word search, case sensitive, case insensitive. So these are always useful to have and know as we're doing any post processing to be able to do filtering. It's a common shortcut to just take the raw data and start to iterate through it and extract whatever's needed. But experience has shown it's safer to just start from scratch, take that data, create a new array, and only pass in the filtered data as it's coming through from the post-processing function. If we are doing a client-side call, again, if the API supports page variables, then there are filter options in the builder of the ViewBox to allow us to get to that. If there aren't, there's a post-processing JavaScript function. Now we're in client side, so that means we have access to JavaScript. So we have JavaScript code, and again, the filtering functions are now different, obviously. They are dot includes, which is string search, dot includes with a conversion to lowercase to do a case insensitive search, and we can have a complete regex expression if you want to be more specific and flexible about what we're filtering with. So those are the options that are available to us when we're doing filtering. If we have a list, then if we're doing a server-side call, again, the exact same things apply. We need to use XBasic, and when we're using XBasic, we use the search functions that we know and iterating through the data set and creating a new one. If it's a client-side call, so it's JSON, then there are filter options in the data source, and in that case, we have a no-code implementation. Again, a filter is always applied in that case, but since this is now a syntax that we build, we can add an OR condition to allow a complete unfiltered result set to come back. We can also define list search client side. As we know, one of the features of a list is that it allows search. It has a search capability and tab that opens up, and that allows for client-side searches, server-side searches, or both. In this case, we'll be doing client-side searches, obviously, and that is also a very easy to build no-code implementation. So that's how we get to filtering. Then, if we need to sort the data that's coming in, either because it's unsorted from the way it's coming in through the endpoint, or the endpoint doesn't offer such features, then if we're talking about a ViewBox, then really the ViewBox itself does not offer any easily implemented method to do sorting after the data has arrived. Whereas the list, we have client side, as we know, sorting built in. So the moment we have our complete data set from the API endpoint, just clicking on the column headers, if we are have a columnar view, or just calling the sort method allows us to sort, and that's how we do it in the list. And now for Crud, to be able to do inserts, updates, and deletes, So again, the ViewBox is not a suitable control for that. A ViewBox is usually there to display data and make it hot clickable to access some maybe more data behind it, but not really suited for CRUD operations. The control that's suited for CRUD operations, as we know, is the list control. And again, we have options to do CRUD server side or client side. With client side, it's really not an easy to support structure because of what we need to trap to be able to do the updates. To be able to actually do CRUD against a remote API endpoint, we need to grab the events that fire when a list detail view is updated, and then call the relevant methods of that remote API to do posts or puts or updates. And that's exactly the way that we do it with a list. So a list has a detailed view. That detailed view has and now enables a save list edits method to do a sync, and that enables an unsynchronized event to fire. That unsynchronized event of the detailed view is what we can trap with our XBasic code and then fire our REST API relevant verbs and methods to grab the data from the list that was dirty, essentially the data that was inserted or updated or edited, or the rows that were deleted, and perform the equivalent actions using the same API methods that are documented from the API provider. So that's how we will achieve CRUD operations with the list. Obviously, we're going to see examples of all of these. One complication arising from working with remote APIs is, as in many cases is needed, to have authentication, especially if we're doing CRUD. APIs don't allow people to just go in and start accessing data and manipulating data. So like a connection string with a SQL database has a user ID and password, the same applies for many APIs. They require some sort of authentication. And the standard option is a permanent API key. So there's a key that is provided in some kind of dashboard that you have in that API provider's account. They provide that API key, and then you need to pass in that API key with every request that you do towards that API. Again, with a client-side call, the concern that it's not that it's not possible, but if we have an API key that we're using client-side, that means that API key is visible. If you open up Chrome DevTools, the request that fires the API endpoint will include the API key if we're doing it client-side. So there's a major security concern there. So although it is possible to use an API key client-side, it is not really recommended. It defeats the whole purpose of having a secure and secret API key. But if we're doing it server-side, then we have multiple ways to do that. We can pass it in a URL parameter, like we would the filtering options that we mentioned earlier. And again, with a ViewBox, for example, this is a no-code implementation. If we have parameters, authentication key, API keys that need to be passed in the header, then for the ViewBox, if the data source is configured as a REST API, then that's directly accessible there. If we have a custom data source, we just, in our XBasic code, we're going to be adding that header parameter to the call that we do. And if it's a list, again, like we would do for a normal URL parameter, we do need XBasic code to be able to do the same thing. If there's a rare case that the API key needs to be passed in the body, and again, this requires XBasic both on the ViewBox and the list option. So there are direct methods to do it in the ViewBox with a REST API data source or directly in the URL, but all other options require some coding. Now, there is another authentication option, which is an expiring API key. So the permanent API key is something you get once, and it is there permanently until you disable it from that same environment of the API provider. But there's also an option of an expiring key where you request a temporary token and you exchange that for an API key that is only valid for a certain short period of time, a few hours perhaps. So if you have an expiring key, then again, to do any kind of security call, authentication call using the API key client side, is not only not supported and complex to implement, but it's a security concern. We don't want API keys exposed client side. So we would not follow that path. But for server side call, again, for both cases of a view box and of a list, we need to handle that in XBasic ourselves. We need to do that exchange of the temporary token and then grab back the time-limited API key. And once we've done that, everything else is the same as we described above. And there are some other cases that you may come up against that actually require a user to enter some credentials. There's the pop-up, sometimes a custom dialog or pop-up that appears for people to actually log in with. That is what gets sent to the API provider's backend, sends back a temporary API key, and that now API key is used and to make all of these calls. So that option is really a combination of JavaScript and XBasic to do the initial dialog presentation to the user, grab the code that came back and get an API key out of it. Now, we didn't mention the other option, and again, we're going to see some examples of this, of a curl command, where we don't get a URL, but just get a syntax of a curl command. And there's a genie in XBasic, we just call it a curl genie, that basically says we can just paste in the curl command that we were given. So we can just go here and paste in this, and what we get out of it is XBasic code, the exact code that we need to run that curl genie with all the parameters that are required. But the other option is, even if you don't want to do that, you can just actually review the curl command, and after a little bit of experimenting and working with it, you get to understand. For example, this says use a get verb, and the header contains just a string of the key in this format, API key. So this is also able to be broken down and rebuilt manually without using curl at all. But it's much easier to just, if you have the curl statement, just paste in the curl genie and be able to use it directly in your XBasic code. So now that we've seen all of these options in a diagram, let's go see how all of these work in an actual UX component. So we've built a number of examples mapped and based on the parts of the paths that we saw earlier. And we're just going to walk through them and see how they work, and then how they were actually configured in the Alpha Anywhere IDE. So let's start with a very simple example, which is a view box, which is configured to do a server-side call to the JSON placeholder URL, and it is pointing to the posts path. So we're going to get a list of posts. This is a URL option. There is no authentication. There are no parameters or filtering. It's just a very basic a request to get data. So there it is, and there's the data coming back. So you can see 100 posts from 10 different users came in via server call. Server call means the server is the one that actually, so the view box performed an AJAX callback to the alpha server. The alpha server is the one that made the call to that remote API endpoint. It got the data and sent back to the client and the view box. So that was the simplest example of how that works, server side. Now, we also have the option of a client side call. So here in the data source, when we picked a REST API, remember previously we had server, now we can choose client. And the difference is, instead of typing in the URL in the field, we now have a function to return the URL. That means we can build this URL as we need it in code. And again, no other property, no authentication, no filtering, just like that. And I fire it, and there's the data, that same list of 100 posts. Now, you may have noticed something which is obvious when you think about it, the speed difference of this process happening. So if I just bring up DevTools here for a moment, and let's time the two operations. So let me go to the server call first and call it out. You'll see that it took 800, 900 milliseconds to get the response back. We do it a few more times just to get an average. So you see it's hovering around that value. If I do a client-side call, you can see the kind of difference that we're talking about. It's almost instantaneous to perform this action client-side versus server-side once we're in the view box. So that is one of the parameters, remember, we discussed and considered if we're going to do these operations server-side or client-side. And there are some cases where we make the choice. There are other cases where what we need to do beyond this point sort of makes that choice for us. But you can already see the kind of speed difference that we're seeing here. So the next option is a list. So again, these two were view boxes, and now we'll go to a list. Now a list in its data source does not have a REST API option. So if we're talking about a server-side call, the only thing we can do is call an basic function. In this case, we call it list server call, and list server call just does this. We have a wrapper function called REST call that just calls in the end HTTP fetch. Remember the generic, the flexible HTTP underscore asterisk option. So instead of doing HTTP get, we use HTTP wrapper on HTTP fetch, or at least I do here, because I can then reuse the same wrapper in the case when I do have to pass in headers or some other configuration parameters. So that's all we're doing. We're saying do a REST call, do an HTTP fetch out to that endpoint with a get verb, get the body, get the JSON part of it, response.body, and send that back to the list. So there's a list server call, and we refresh, and there's a data coming back again as a list. Now, you will have noticed that the data that we sent back as a response to this function call is not the exact response we got back from HTTP fetch, but it is the body element of it. So how did we know that? When we configured the view box and did a server call or a client call, we didn't do anything like that. We just said, go to this URL and get the data back. So that was easier to set up. If we're doing an HTTP fetch, then there's an object coming back with a response, which includes other fields as well. And it's the response body that we're interested in. If we want to see all of that, then we can just do a debug here. So when we run that component, we can go in and examine all the data coming back. So the top level item that will come in is not the one we usually need from an HTTP fetch. We need to dive in a little bit deeper, and we have some more complex examples a little bit later on. So let me go back to that list. There it was. And let me do a refresh. So there's our debugger. And what you'll notice is if I check the response that came back, you see that it has a number of properties here. And it's the body one that has the data that we want. There it is in a string. So that's the real data that we want out of it. This is why we had to say send back the response.body, or else if we got an error text, then send back the response.error text. In this case, it was blank, so we sent back the actual data. Okay, again, we're going to see a lot of these manipulations as we're going through our data. But this is just one of the examples here. So that was the list with a server-side call. A list with a client-side call is directly JSON. The list has an option to say the data source is a JSON file, and that JSON file, it can be a file name on a file system, but it can also be a URL, and it goes and reads that data from there. And there's our list client call. So if we do a refresh here, there's our data coming in. There is also a difference here. it's worth a look. So this was our list server call, and I'm going to time it. And you can see it takes 1.3 seconds, so almost half a second more than the equivalent viewbox method, the server-side one. If I go to the client call again in the list, it's comparable. As you can see, there is not that huge difference that we got before with the viewbox being done client side. So this just goes to show what is probably known to most of you, that the list control is a heavy control, much heavier than the viewbox. So if the requirement is does not require all the complete functionality that the list offers, and you can do what you need to do with the viewbox, that's almost always preferred with respect to the to how heavy the whole UX will be to load and render, and what the performance will be. So that was just as an aside there. And let's get back to our various scenarios here. So that was the client-side list call. Now, let's go look at some filtering options. So let's go back to the viewbox scenario, doing a server call, but in this time we want to filter it. And we want to say we only want to bring back records of user ID number 1. Remember, if I go back to my viewbox of a normal server call, I had 10 user IDs in this list. So if I just want to bring data back from user ID 3, that's how I do it. And there it is. And I can also filter within the title. So if I filter for EST, you can see that now that just brought back 1 record. So if we go to see how that was configured, sorry, that was here, viewbox server call filtered. So what we'll see is our data source is configured like this, but we add page variables in the end. And how do we know what page variables to use? Well, the API documentation tells us so. So if we go back to the JSON placeholder example, and look at post, for example, we can see that you can filter based on the user, and we can see a guide that gives us this information, for example, to say get a specific resource, get that post, list order resources, and filtering is where we do page variable ID equals to the user that we want. So that's exactly what we implemented here. And as an input now, we're using the value of the field, in this case, the user field, so post user. So that was the, let's say, the server-side filtering of things. When we performed this query against the API endpoint, the data that we got back included data just for user 3. But then we have another filter field, in this case, title. And just to demonstrate the capability, we added also a post-process basic function with which we did the filtering of this. If the API supported filtering on title as well, we could do that as well in the URL to add another page variable. But in this case, we're demonstrating how to do it even if the API does not support it. So what this says is after this filtered set of data has been brought back, we pass it through a post-process basic function called viewbox server call filter. And if I go to see that, so you can see we're grabbing, we've set the value of this field to an argument, and we're using, remember the syntax that we said, the $, $, for case sensitive, case insensitive match, and so on. So we're saying, does the filter title match what's coming in from the data? And if so, then push it into a separate array and then send back that array. Otherwise, do not include it in the array to send. So this is the way we've managed to do filtering at 2 levels, filtering against the API endpoint and filtering within the data set that came back in our server-side call, as we showed here. If we move to the client scenario, so viewbox client call filtered, Then we have similar things configured. So now the API endpoint is a JavaScript function. So you can see we just a process to say, if there's nothing selected for the user, then just send the whole, select the whole URL, so bring back everything. Otherwise, just add a filter and add the filter to use like that based on the value of that field. Now, you may have noticed that with this option, we also noted it in the mind map that we went through, we have a capability that we didn't have in the Viewbox server option, which was in the Viewbox server option, we absolutely need to pick a user. There's no way for us to display everything. And the reason that is done is that because of the way the URL is defined, this needs to have a value. We're forcing a page variable of user ID equals with a value. And that forces us to make a selection with one of the users in the list. Whereas in the client-side Viewbox, since we have a JavaScript function, we can be more flexible to do what we just showed. So if there's no value selected for a user, then just bring back everything. And then maybe filter it in the post-processing basic, but at least we're getting the whole data set back. So those are the Viewbox options for filtering. If you're gonna go to the list, so again, we can refresh the whole thing. There it is, all 100 users, all 100 posts, I'm sorry. And then we can do similar things like we did before. So there are all the posts from user ID 3, and then on this title, we just get one back like we saw before. So the way this was done is, obviously it's a custom data source, as we said. So list server call filtered is the function that we need. And what list server call filter does is to use that same wrapper to do an HTTP fetch. So we've got our response. We check our filters if we have a filter. Now both filters are applied after the data has been brought back, and we filter based on the user, which is a numeric value, and based on the title, which is a character value. And we do the same like we did before. We build a new array. If the search conditions match, add each item to the array. Otherwise, do not. And then produce a JSON string with the result to send back to the list. That was the server-side filtering. Now, on the client-side filtering, there it is again. We can do this, as we said. So we do have a JSON option. We can directly point a URL to it. So we don't have any options here. But we can have a filter. And essentially, it's like applying a where clause, but we're applying it against this. So we've created some arguments here based on the field names. So post user filter for, or post filter for the value. It's either set, so the user ID is set to this value, or the value is nothing. So that filters the incoming result set. So this is the list filtered. So if I say again user 3, there's only data from user 3, and if I say in title, then again client-side search to bring us here. The next item is the complete CRUD operation, like we mentioned. So we've done viewing, we've done filtering and searching. If we had a columnar view, as we know, the sort option is already built into the list, so we could have done that. But now comes the time to say, well, we need to do some updates or inserts or deletes in the data. And if we move to that list, which is this one, so there it is, list or refresh. There's our data. And we'd like to do some edits against it. Now, in this case, obviously, this is not a real API in the sense that data will not actually change, but we do get indications that our action succeeded. So we've used in-place editing, and we can edit, we can delete, we can add a new row. So if you say, for example, we want to edit something, let's say we want to change and capitalize here. We have our normal synchronize button, the same that we would have for our detail view. And we run the synchronize, and there's the status code success coming back from the API that succeeded. So how was that done with those same buttons? So let's go here and look at it in more detail. The API access option is the simplest one. Just point to the API endpoint and just grab all of the data. We didn't have any filtering on the screen. But then we've enabled the list detail view as if we were going to edit the list manually against a SQL data source. But then what we did was in the detail view, not in the list events, but in the detail view events, there is an event called onSynchronize. So that is an basic function that is called when the user attempts to synchronize the data. And this basic function is being passed in the data of the list as it was being edited. So let's go look at that function in our basic functions, and that is sync data. So this is the function for updates, deletes, and inserts. So it's not a lot of code for that kind of power, but essentially what it does is it says inside the E object, we're getting back E.list data, which is the data that came in. We're going through each row of the list that came in, and one of the properties is what was the change in the data that was submitted, i.e., is that row that is coming in, is it a new row, is it a deleted row, or is it an edited row? And knowing that, we know what kind of REST verb to use in our HTTP action towards the REST API with the data that we need to use. So we're passing in the row. Remember, we have the wrapper REST call that we use here for HTTP fetch. HTTP fetch can be used for anything, get, put, post. So one of the options is to pass in a row body. And the row body here is what we're passing in with the values. So we're saying title, body, and user ID. These are the fields in the remote API. Remember, the posts have a title, a body, and a user ID. The post ID obviously is an auto increment key. So as we're going through, we check each row, and if it's a new row, for example, then we need to do a post. So we do a post against this endpoint, passing in this data as it came in from the list. If it's a deleted row, then we call the delete verb against that same endpoint and pass in the row ID this time of the row that needs to be deleted. This is the primary key on the API side of things. And if the list is dirty, we need to do a put with the ID of the list data. And we send back a response, that pop-up message that you saw there, to indicate if that the status code of 200, which means a success. If it got gotten back any other number, would have meant a fail. So that was how we're able to do a complete CRUD series of actions pointing to the remote API, just taking advantage of that on-sync event. Now, everything we've done up until now has been against a non-authenticated API endpoint, and that's how we've been working. But as we've said, in most cases, especially when there's CRUD involved, especially when there are changes, insert, deletes, or updates, but in many cases also for reads, there's some form of authentication required. So let's go look at a few examples there. So let's go to a ViewBox server call with URL authentication. URL authentication is really no different than what we've been doing up until now on the URL side. This is the most basic of authentication methods, and it says the API key that needs to be passed in is passed in as a page variable. So it's essentially, it's part of the URL. And because it's part of the URL, we can use the same methods that we used before to get to the endpoint, just passing in another item, in this case, the API key. So here's the NASA API endpoint, and we're going to get space event notifications coming in, and there they are. Space weather forecasts, experimental information, and so on. So that allowed us to get to read through that. That was the server call, as we saw. There's also a client call. And, client call with authentication. And in this case, we're going against the NASA API again. But in this case, we're checking Curiosity rover images. And we're passing in also a search parameter that says, what is the Mars day that we want to use the photos for? So this is the client-side call with authentication. So here's how this works. The endpoint remains as we knew it. We're building a return value with JavaScript, but we are adding the value of the field. This is the standard, and then we're adding the API key to the URL like we discussed before. So this is a combination of authentication and search. And we know that we can do this because if we go to the NASA API descriptor, we're going to see that one of the parameters here is sol. So that's how we know that we need to enter that. Okay, so we've entered that there, and that was all that was needed. That's the way authentication happened. So if you want to look at the images for Mars day 1, just refresh, and there they are. If we want to look at Mars day 1000, refresh, and there they are. Isn't that amazing that we can do all of that just with a demo key? So that was a authentication using just a page variable there. Now there are other options like we discussed earlier in the mind map walkthrough, which is the header authentication. So header means you're not passing it in as a page variable, but you're passing it in the header of the request that you're sending. So in this case, we're pointing to an API that provides holiday dates for a country and a specific year. And this supports header authentication. And the way we know that is that if we go to the documentation for that site, we see that it says pass authorization header and API key in the header of your request. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So we say we have an option here in the viewbox builder when we've enabled has custom headers. And in the custom headers, we build that object with a name, authorization, and a value of our API key that we got from that site when we signed up for that service. So having done that, the request that goes out uses that authentication key. So that's what allows us to bring data back. But then we've also defined 2 additional parameters that we'll look at in a moment. First of all, let's see what happens. So we click on refresh. And there's the data that came back. So the holidays for US for 2020. Now, if you remember, in many cases, the object that comes back from a REST call is not at the level that we need the actual data. We have other data above it or sibling data next to it. So we need to be able to separate the path that we need. And a great way to do that in the view box is that there's a method to view the data that's coming in directly. So let me do the following. Let me quickly just remove holidays from here. And let me also remove the post-processing. So we're just going to get raw data as it's coming in. So let's see how that looks. So make a REST call, it's authenticated, this is what came back. But as you can see, we've got some top level fields here that we don't want. The item that we want is holidays. Here's our array of holidays. So it's the holidays element that we need. So we can set that here in the JSON path. We can say the path that we need is holidays. Okay, so let's see our sample data now. Delete that, make a REST call again. Reformat. So it did come back, but there's a glitch. And again, we would have expected to have gotten this. So one square bracket to indicate the start of the array, then the objects, and then a closing bracket at the end. But we've got an extra square bracket. There's no explanation why. That's just how this specific API works. And the reason I've included it here is to just demonstrate sometimes the variance in the kind of data that we're coming back, where you might expect a standard response, but in this case, we're getting something that is non-standard. But we can still do something about it, and that's why we have the post-process xbasic function. So if you remember, we had a function here, viewbox server call, header authentication process, and if we go look at that xbasic function, you can see that all it does is grab the first element of the array. So essentially, we had an array within an array. So the array that we were looking for is the first element. Remember, xbasic is the first element of the array is 1. It's not 0 indexed, it's 1 indexed. So that's all we're doing. We're returning the object. We're parsing, obviously, to get from string to a dot variable. We're getting the first element of the array, and we're generating JSON again, string text that we need to send back. So that was the kind of processing that was involved to get us the actual data that we need to show. Okay, that was the server-side call. We have equivalent things for the client-side call. So again, we have our API endpoint. We just constructed it like this. We don't have any filters. We're just pointing to the URL, but we do have custom headers. There are the custom headers. They're built a little bit differently now, using JavaScript, but essentially the same concept. It's an array of name value pairs. That's what we're passing in. And again, we are using a path to get holidays, and there's some JavaScript to process it. In this case, we can just do directly data 0. Remember, in JavaScript, an array is 0 indexed. So similar methods to achieve the exact same result, which is how do I get the actual final version of the form of the data that we need. Client call, header authentication, I'm sorry, and there's the data coming through. Okay, and then one last option, if all of these built-in tools fail and don't produce the result that we need, then we can just go to xbasic, and we can say, well, we're not getting what we need, so let's choose a custom data source, and let's pick an xbasic function, and we can do all the process that we need there. So viewbox server call authenticated. So if I go back to our xbasic functions, there it is. So again, I'm just using xbasic methods to, first of all, do the REST call like we said on the wrapper method. We're getting the item back, and then we're extracting JSON extract. Remember, response body is the text information that we need. We're extracting the holidays element out of it, and that's what we're sending back. This is still a string now, and that's why we're able to send that back as the result of this function. That's what we're sending to the viewbox, so it can be populated with the data. So as you saw, there is, and let's see that in action. Actually, we didn't see that running, and there it is. Same results obviously as before. Now, the last thing I wanted to demonstrate today is what happens if even these are not sufficient, and the only thing we have from the API provider that we're working with is a curl command. So we can just copy the curl command as we find it in the documentation of the vendor, and we will use our curl genie to convert that into a usable xbasic. So let me go here at the end, and I'm going to add a view box. I'm going to call it view box curl, and I'm going to put it in a panel card. So in my, so I'm going to need an XBasic function, and I'm going to call this function curl get C E as P. This is what we're going to call from the view box as a function. Now, how do we configure what's inside? We go to our genies, and there's a curl command genie. So I've copied that curl command that we got from the provider. I just pasted it in here. I say generate XBasic. There's our XBasic. And I can use the long version here, the detailed one. We can change many of the parameters. We can just use the short version here. So I can just say copy to clipboard, press OK, and there's our function. So only thing left for me to do now is to replace my API key here with a real one. And luckily I have one from this service, News Catcher API. So I'm going to replace my API key here, there. And obviously the response here will need to check what we want out of the response, so we can just do that from the builder. So curl get is the function that we need. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go to our view box here. I'm going to say the data source is it's a data box type of view box. It is a custom data source. This is the function, and since I've defined a custom function here, if I just point to fields, that initially would bring me back nothing because I have not looked at what this is bringing back. So to be able to do that, I just go back to my XBasic and add a debug 1 here, and that's how I can go and see what the data brings back. So I don't even need to run this. I can just go here directly and go to fields, which calls that function. So if I check what the response sent back, you can see we've got an OK. But if we want to look at the content, so we definitely need response.content. And then in there, we're looking for articles. So response.content articles. So the function that we need is JSON extract response content, comma, article. So we can check this directly here, see if it gives it what we need. And it does. So it's bringing back just that. So that's what we need. I'm going to copy it here, get out of the debugger. I haven't configured it yet, that's why it complained. But now I'm going to go here, I'm going to remove this, I don't need it anymore. I'm going to say curl get equals JSON extract of articles. So now if I go back to my view box and go to fields, there now are all the fields that are going to come back. So I can do a quick setup here to say use a genie, use a list row container, and inside the list row container show title, publish date, and summary. Okay, so that's it, and I can just run my working preview from here. And I'm going to go to my last page and move one more, and there's the data that came back. I haven't formatted this obviously yet still, but as you can see, there's my data coming back. So that was a way to get the curl genie to produce the data that we need if what we're given from the API provider is a curl statement. So we've shown multiple different combinations to achieve similar end results, but really the takeaway I would hope from all of these is that there is quite a bit of capability and flexibility in the builder tools that we have in view boxes and lists to be able to do a lot of what's needed with the variance that that's expected from the other side, and the lack of standardization in the kind of data that's coming back and the format of the data that's coming back, to still be able to use minimal coding to get to the data that we need. And as you've probably seen, REST APIs are proliferating, and it's only natural that you will encounter these as you're building apps. So it's useful to know at least what the built-in features are and the ways that you can go beyond those built-in features to get access to that data. So this concludes our session on APIs as data sources for list and view boxes, and doing the complete cycle of view and filtering, adding, updating, deleting remote API data. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you for watching, and thank you for joining.
Nikos, thank you very much. That was a absolutely terrific presentation on APIs, and you actually got a lot of great feedback on it. I am sure you probably also have quite a few questions that we couldn't get to because our session is over. But if you do have questions, go ahead, send them to guides, GUIDES at alphasoftware.com, and we will be happy to get back to you with those. Our next session is a customer showcase. We're featuring Ronald Gray from House of Rayford. That'll be at 11:45, just about 15 minutes from now. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.